This is Community Interest Television Programming, and I'm George Morang, your host. And we're meeting today with Chris Gubler of Gubler Orchids, who is going to tell us something about the orchid business. Chris, I'm George Morang.
Nice
How do you do?
George.
Thanks for seeing us today.
Well, it's a real treat for you guys to come out and take an interest in what we do out here in Landers.
Well, I've known you've been around for a number of years. How long have you been in operation out here?
Well, we've been in the Landers area for 22 years now.
And this has been growing orchids all that time?
Yeah, growing orchids, carnivorous plants, and some bromeliads.
Oh, there's a whole variety then. These are some of the examples of the flowers that you ship?
Yes, these are some of the blooming orchids that we ship. We sell quite a few seedlings, anywhere in the neighborhood of 20,000 seedlings per month. And then we supplement that with about 10,000 blooming orchids and another 20,000 carnivorous plants.
But you don't actually ship cut flowers?
No, we're not in the cut flower business, a potted house plant.
And who buys these potted plants?
Well, we're dealing with 6 of the 10 largest retailers in the country, such as Home Base, Home Depot, Builders Square back east, White Rose Nursery and Crafts in Canada, and so on.
And the person that buys one of these orchids from one of those retailers, they can just use it as a house plant?
That's correct. Our whole hybridizing program is based on indoor plant growth for the home.
And you select the plant type so that it will adapt to the house home environment.
Right. Every time we have a group of plants that are blooming, we take the plants that have the showiest flowers, the hardiest growth, and then we test them in a home environment to see how they last.
And there's no extreme environmental controls necessary in order to grow them. What I'm saying is you don't need a greenhouse.
That's correct. The key is adequate lighting. So if you're in a condo facing north, it's really not a good idea to get an orchid, but any other window will work.
Can you use artificial light?
Oh yes, we do right here.
What sort of artificial light do you use?
Here we use metal halide lamps, and that's basically to force extra growth during the winter months.
And in the form that you ship them to your dealers, the retail outlets, how are they done?
Well, each plant is carefully packaged so that the soil doesn't come out of the container, and then we wrap the flowers in a floral hay so that they don't bruise in shipment.
Could we take a look at some of the sort of plants that you ship to the retailer?
Certainly.
Good. So we go over there and take a look now?
Yeah.
Okay, let's go. I'm standing with Chris now in a building, and he's going to tell me something about this building and its unique qualities.
Well, George, this is the first solar insulated building greenhouse that was ever built. We actually use no propane here in the harsh winters to heat this building. It's all coming from little fans on the top of the ceiling, pumping hot, humid air into the ground, and in the ground we're storing the heat. We reach dew point to remove the humidity, and what we've actually created in here is almost like a biosphere.
Oh, that's very interesting. And what media do you store it in?
Dirt.
In dirt? Just warm the dirt?
Yeah, we warm the ground, and the ground has the ability to hold a tremendous amount of energy.
And you pump it down into the ground,
right,
into that area, and then the natural convection will bring it back up into the building.
That's correct. There's a special system underground where the heat is dispersed into the soil, and then at night, when the ambient temperature falls below the soil temperature, then we get the radiant heat coming from the bottom. And this is ideal for plant growth because then we're warming the root zone as well.
Excellent. Very interesting indeed. I see we have a display in front of us here. What are we looking at right here?
Well, we're looking at the first product that we're able to sell. This little seedling is 2.5 years old.
And that's a plant that's been grown from seed?
That is correct. It takes 2.5 years to grow a plant this size, and it takes another 2.5 years until it blooms.
Then these are 5 years old?
That's correct.
Do you sell any in this stage of development?
Yes, we do. We like to sell the seedlings primarily because we can turn them faster. They require less space than the larger plants. But we have a combination of everything so that we can put together a display to offer the consumer any type of orchid they want.
I notice there's a picture on there, and that describes the kind of orchid that is that you've developed there.
That's correct. It's an estimate of the flower color. In the back, there's a little history about what type of orchid it is, and on the inside is complete growing instructions.
Do these orchids all come from Costa Rica originally?
No, not all of them. Actually, what people don't realize is the orchid family is the largest flowering plant family in the world. And as a matter of fact, I'm sure everyone in the viewing audience has eaten an orchid sometime in their life.
Oh, in what form would they have eaten it?
Vanilla.
Oh, of course, yeah. What about garlic? Is that a...
No, that's not an orchid.
Now, you say that plant is a seedling, so that you take seeds from the mature plant. How are they pollinated?
Well, what we're going to do is we're going to go into the greenhouse later on, and we'll pollinate an orchid, and we'll see a developing seed pod so that everybody can get a complete understanding of how we produce the orchids.
Good. Could we go take a look at that step?
By all means.
Thank you. Let's go now, and we'll take a look at the pollination. Chris is now going to show us how the seeds are generated. Chris, will you show us how you pollinate the plant?
Yes. First of all, what makes an orchid is this distinctive lip, which is a modified sepal. Inside that lip is what we call a column. You see that right here. At the end of that column is a pollen cap, which I will carefully pull the pollen cap off. And inside are 4 pollinia, which has thousands and thousands of pollens encapsulated. For demonstration purposes, I've taken a flower off, and you can see the column now very clearly, and you see the shiny coating there. That's where the insect would fly, and the pollen is placed there and is removed when the insect backs out.
Oh, you're doing what naturally would be done by an insect going after nectar from one flower to another. He would pick up the pollen on one flower and then distribute it on the next one as he goes for the nectar.
That is correct. Now, after pollinization, within 48 hours, this flower begins to collapse around the column to protect from further pollinization, and we have an example of that right here. Now, you'll notice that there's a yellow tag hanging on the seed pod, which is actually developing behind the flower. So the pollen moves from the column back through the ovaries back here to make a seed pod. Each tag has the name of the pollen parent, the mother plant, when it was pollinated, so that we have a due date. And each seed pod ripens according to genera. So some ripen within 6 weeks, and others can take up to a year.
Do you pollinate within the flowers of the individual plant, or do you pollinate from one plant to another?
We like to go from one plant to another. What I just showed today is what we call selfing, where we pollinate from the same plant.
Is that called inbreeding?
Yeah, pretty much. What we try to do, though, is we try to stay within the same genus. For example, the purple orchid is a Cattleya. This is a Cattleya. We could crossbreed between these two, but on the Phalaenopsis, which the seed pod is a lot more mature, that wouldn't be, you couldn't breed that. That would be like a monkey to a human.
But there are some plants that you could crossbreed and get some sort of variation.
Oh yeah, if they're closely related, you can do a lot of exotic breeding. Yes.
How many mother plants do you have?
Well, pretty much a quarter of this whole greenhouse is devoted to breeding. We have probably close to 600 plants for hybridization.
And each one of them has to be individually hand-pollinated.
That is correct. All the hybridization is done by me. I generally do it on a Saturday where there's no phone calls or interruptions. Breeding is best done when in the middle of the day when it's sunny. If it's a cloudy day, the take ratio of where you have a successful pollination is a lot lower on a cloudy day.
It's a lot lower on a cloudy day, the take is.
Right.
Do you have any idea why?
Well, I think mainly it's because there's not as many insects on a cloudy day as there is in a sunny day.
Oh, I see. They're more receptive on the sunny day. And these plants here, after you have generated a seed pod, at some point in time, you decide it's ready to get the seeds out. Right,
exactly. That's why we label the tag. For example, the ones that are turning yellow here, These are ready for harvest. These were pollinated back in February. The seed pod up here has been pollinated back in June, so this has a while to go still.
Do you arrange them physically on the trays so you know which ones need your attention in some sort of sequence?
I try to keep them together by genera.
I see, but how would you know at what time this is probably ready?
Grower's instinct.
Or the appearance of the plant?
Right, what we try to do is we try to harvest the seed pod before it turns yellow, and that's a technique called green potting, because inside this capsule the seed is sterile. So all we need to do is sterilize the outside of the pod and then cut it open and sow the seed.
Oh, and you sow the seed in some kind of sterile environment?
That's correct, and that's where we're going to go next.
Oh, can we take a look at that step?
Yes.
Thank you. Where are we now, Chris?
Well, we're in the lab now, George. This room here has over 1 million orchids.
All these little green things we see in here, those are orchids?
That's correct. There's about 1,000 orchids in this, what we call the mother flask. When the seed pod is ripe, we send it here to the lab and we assign it a cross number, which is a reference to the hybrid, which is the mother and father, and the date that we sowed the seed, which in this case was May 18th.
So you keep a record of these all through the process, from the mother plant up to the eventual full-grown plant?
That's correct. Once we've assigned a cross number, this particular number will follow that group of plants all the way through for the rest of their lives.
How do you fill the jar? How is it that you grow plants and not mold, like I would?
Well, in the other room we have laminar flow hoods which filter out all the spores and bacteria from the air. Some people are familiar with the HEPA filtered vacuums. Well, we have a huge HEPA filter and we work in those flow hoods.
Oh, I see. So the room is a sterile environment.
Correct.
It's like making computer chips.
That's exactly right.
And this stage of development, how long does it stay in the little jar like this?
In the mother flask, they stay anywhere from 4 to 6 months. When they get a little bit bigger, what we do is we make what we call a replate flask, or a spread, and this is where they begin to develop their leaves and their roots.
So you have to take them out of that flask and put them in this jar.
And reflask them into the spread, correct.
What do? Just open the top and shake them in?
Yeah, basically from this stage here, since they're still so round, you can see that they just move right around. We can just spread them out literally like margarine on toast, and then they begin to develop leaves and roots.
Where do they get any nourishment while they're in this jar?
Well, this black jello type substance is actually an agar, and it's fortified with all the plant nutrition that is required for plant growth, including sugar and water.
What keeps it moist?
Well, it's like jello. It's full of...
It is moist.
Yeah.
Don't worry about it.
That's right. It's so super fortified that if any bacteria or fungal spores got inside, it would grow mold instantly and kill the orchids.
Oh, I see. So the point of keeping the environment sterile and handling them with sterile precautions is very, very important.
It's critical. We have a contamination rate up here in the laboratory of about 5%.
Oh, that sounds amazing.
Yeah, for out in the desert, we're pretty impressed, and we work really hard to keep that figure as constant as possible.
Well, these are pretty small, these plants still, but they are beginning to show some leaves?
That is correct. They're just developing their first leaves and roots, and about 8 months later, they'll go back into the flow hood and be separated into what we call replates.
That flow hood is a...
How's that for a rabbit out of my hat?
Hey, that's it.
Complete leaves and complete roots. And if you look, George, you'll see that the auger has pulled away from the roots. That's because the plant's taken up the water. And I'm sure that we've all had Jell-O somewhere in the refrigerator a little longer than we should, and it pulls away from the glass. That's because of the water evaporating out. It begins to then...
I hate Jell-O. But I'll take your word on the Jell-O.
Right. Now, this particular flask here now would be ready to be sent down to our front building so it can be acclimated to the normal day length. Up here, daytime starts around 5 p.m. and ends at 8 in the morning.
That's the controlled environment with the light.
That is correct. The orchids here have 16-hour days, beautiful 78-degree sunny days every day.
Yeah. Okay, can we go take a look at the next step when you take these little plants out and replant them?
Certainly.
Okay. Chris, you told us about the laminar flow hoods that are used. Why are they used and how are they used? Can you tell us about that?
Well, all the work up here is done under laminar flow hoods, and I'll turn it on for a moment so you get an idea of the sound it makes. Up here is a pre-filter that filters out 95% of the spores, and then back here behind the egg crate is a HEPA filter, which virtually filters out all the bacterial and fungal spores.
Oh, spores are the actually the seeds of the fungus and so forth.
That's right, and this media is so super fortified that bacteria and fungus can grow and actually kill the orchids in culture. What we have here is a flask of distilled autoclaved water or sterile water. We have the mother flask here, which we then would transplant with these tools. There's a scoop here that's soaking in bleach. And we take a scoop out and place it into the spread, and then we would use this tool to spread them out into the new auger and let them develop.
And those are the jars over there with the auger in it, the fortified media in which the plants are grown into the next stage.
That's correct. And all the orchids up here spend about 2 years in the laboratory.
2 years in this area here?
That's correct.
Before they're big enough to transplant?
That's correct.
And they're left in here or gone through the transplant into this jar, into this media, until they begin to show individual little plants.
Right. The three basic processes that occur up here is the flasking, where we create the mother bottle, the spreads, where we take these out of the mother bottle and spread them out on a new bottle, and then the final stage is where we separate each individual plant and put in approximately 50 into a flask, which we call a replate.
I notice that at this stage, they look a lot like finely chopped celery.
Right, they're like little tiny marbles, actually. They're round, and you can just roll them around like this. And each one of these dots represents an orchid plant. There's probably about, 3,000-4,000 plants in here.
But that is the germinated seed.
That is correct.
That's right.
That's called a protocorm stage, where there's no leaf or root.
Well, good. Okay, now we're up to the stage where the plants have been here for how long again?
2 years, and the final stage is where we actually introduce the orchids to the real world by taking them out of the flask and putting them into flats.
So the next stage that we're going to look at will be when they're taken out of the flask and transplanted into some other media.
That's right.
Okay. Thank you very much. Let's go take a look at that stage. Chris, I noticed we have a lot of charcoal here. How is the charcoal used in the process?
Well, George, we add activated charcoal to the agar solution so that it can absorb phenol toxins. And what I mean by that is, have you ever bit into an apple and let it sit and it turns brown?
Yes, I know what you mean.
Right. Well, when you deal with little tiny baby orchids, if they turn brown like the apple does, it kills the orchid. And so the charcoal inhibits that so that the orchid can survive.
What we're talking about, the agar, that is the material in which the seeds are planted?
That's right. It's the gelling agent that we use that makes the media firm like this. And we add all the ingredients necessary for plant growth, and we supplement it with
a secret ingredient.
Secret ingredient, banana baby food and pineapple juice. And these both contain certain growth hormones that accelerate the orchid growth.
Those are natural growth hormones that are natural to the fruit itself.
That is correct, and that's why we only use pure ingredients. And baby food works really well because it's pureed so fine that it just blends right into the agar with no problems.
And what about the acid level?
pH is a very, very critical issue up here in the laboratory. Everything is grown at 5.5. If it goes either way, it slows down orchid growth considerably.
And how do you control that?
What we do is we adjust the pH in the final stages of preparation by using calcium hydroxide to bring the pH up to an acceptable level.
Well, so the preparation of this agar that you plant these in is very complicated, really. Well, it is to begin with, anyway.
That's correct. You know, in the laboratory, every step is critical. For example, you'll see there's a little cotton hole up here, a little hole stuffed with cotton, excuse me. And even the way you stuff the cotton in is very, very critical. This allows pressure to escape when the lights come on, and it filters the air when the bottle gets cool when the lights go off. If it's packed too tightly, it's like a pressure cooker, and that inhibits growth.
You must have to have very skilled people here operating a laboratory like this. Who is that person?
We have 2 people working up here normally, and we're looking at having a third because this laboratory produces about 5,000 plants a week.
And your production is going up all the time.
Right. We seem to always be a little bit short, and so we're considering adding a third person up here.
But I understand that you do all the pollinating, that previous step that we talked about, yourself.
That's right. Generally speaking, I make about 150 new hybrids a year. And that's down from when my father was doing it, but I like to make bigger groups of numbers, larger quantities of the same number so that we can offer these type of plants for like 1 year.
Now, 150, that means of a certain type and color, each one of them would be part of that 150.
That's correct. For example, if I made a lavender cattleya like we pollinated earlier, we would make maybe 7 of those crosses during the year, and then we would make maybe 20,000 of each of those crosses for that year.
And that is presented to your market as the production of that particular orchid.
Right. It's, you know, they're strong growing hybrids that are, what we're trying to do is get to free flowering so that there's no seasons.
And these orchids develop characteristics, particular characteristics that you identify, and as an example, their adaptability to the home environment.
Exactly. We used to sell quite a bit to the cut flower trade, and you know, when you're a cut flower grower, what you're concerned about is how quickly does the orchid grow, how many flowers does it produce a year, how does the flower handle when you cut it, the shape of the flower, the color. These are all criteria that are very, very important for a cut flower grower. And for the homeowner, they love that. They love big is better.
And I've noticed as we're talking now about the extreme care that has to be done in generating the orchid from the seed, the tiny seeds, the pollinating the tiny seeds, into the tiny plants that then have to be transplanted. But actually, the orchid is a very hardy plant. And this plant, when it's eventually sold at the retail level, is a house plant.
That's correct. You know, orchids are a very, very strong plant, but like Superman, they have a weakness. And their kryptonite is overwatering. And what people generally do is overwater their orchids, and then the roots begin to die back, and the plant begins to shrivel up, and then they add more water again. And
they can use one of those probes, perhaps, that you get to.
No, that's not a good idea. The orchid mix is a very light mix. It's very porous so that the roots can breathe. And the water meters don't accurately measure the wetness. The easiest way is to pick up the pot and look at the bottom, and if it's dry, give it a drink.
Hey, that's... I can do that. Well, thanks very much, Chris. Let's go take a look at the next step where they take all those little plants that we saw and transplant them again.
Okay, let's go.
Thank you. Well, Chris, we've just about come full circle. We started with the beautiful orchids themselves, the pollinating process, the generation of the seeds, through the laboratory where the seeds are put into the media, and then finally grown to the stage where they actually look like plants. And they have little roots and everything on them. And now we're at the stage where these plants are going to be transplanted into the open, so to speak. I might say that, as you explained to us, the plants are acclimatized in this area here.
That's correct. You know, the orchids have had it really cushy so far. 16-hour days, 78 degrees all the time. Wonderful, wonderful life. All the food they could eat, 100% humidity, no disease problems, and now we're going to introduce them to the real world. The first stage is to get them adjusted to the normal light so they don't have jet lag, and now what we're going to do is we're going to carefully slide them through the neck of this bottle. And it's a big secret. Everybody wanted to know how it's done, so let's go take a look.
Okay, let's take a look at that.
This is the final stage. And we carefully open up the stopper. Now this is the first time that they've been exposed to any contaminated air, regular air. And what we're going to do is we're going to take them out. And Josefina's, this is what she does. She carefully takes them out. And she washes the agar off the roots. It's kind of a little messy process. And who said orchids were fragile?
Yeah, I think we should emphasize at this stage they're becoming quite a hardy plant. They're all destined to be a house plant, and that we should keep in mind.
Each plant is graded, and for example, a plant that's this large would actually go right into a 2-inch container. And you can see that it has has 3 leaves and 4 roots. And if you notice the color of the roots is white, that's the sign of a healthy root, white or silver. You see that there? Then what we do is we take a little pencil or something, and we'll make a divot. We plant it in like so. If you notice, there's a tag here, and that's a reference, that reference number again, the cross number for that particular hybrid. And what we'll do is we'll just plant these in rows like this.
Every one of these plants, you know who the mother plant was.
The mother and the father.
And the father.
Rare these days.
Yeah. But as you pointed out, this plant is such a healthy one that it wouldn't necessarily go into a flat like this, would it?
That's correct. Actually, it would probably go in a container like this and be ready for sale in about 6 months.
See, I'm paying attention.
That's right. There you go. That's how it looks.
But that's not ready for market yet.
No, it needs to harden off, and in about 6 to 8 months, it'd be ready for market.
It will grow considerably during that time, I imagine.
It'll grow, yeah, about 30% larger.
And it's, where does it go from this planting stage? Where are these flats carried?
Everything gets acclimatized in this building because of its unique characteristics. And they all go to the other end over there, if we could pan around somehow.
Okay, we have come full circle. This is where the plants that we've seen transplanted over in the other stage there are now put into the flats to grow into a normal climate and environment. Is that true?
Right, yeah. This is a typical seedling flat. You can see that these plants were a lot smaller than the one that we put in the 2-inch container. The one in the 2-inch container will look like this in about 6 months, and this is ready for market.
And that's shipped to the retailer, your retail customer?
Yes, shipped all over the world. Our big markets in Canada and out of state as well.
Good. Well, Chris, it's been very enjoyable to visit here today and very informative. I certainly enjoyed it. Gubler's Orchids is quite a part of the community here.
Yeah, we've been involved with the community for a long time now. We're working with the Chamber of Commerce and Homestead Valley Park and Recreation for the 3rd Annual Orchid Festival, which will be October 9, 10, and 11 this year.
What goes on at the Orchid Festival?
Well, it's a lot of fun. We empty out our packing areas so that the arts and crafts people can move in and show their goods. The Little League sells things. The park has a dinner. The Chamber of Commerce sponsors a Polynesian dance. There's about 13, 14 nonprofit organizations involved, and they all seem to benefit one way or another from the festival.
Oh, that's great that you form the forum for these nonprofit organizations to show their wares and to make sales and so forth.
Right. Our main goal is to attract new visitors up into the Morang Basin and spend a weekend up here, and that benefits Yucca Valley, 29, the whole basin.
Yeah. We like to look at it from the point of view of the whole basin. Well, again, Chris, it's been a great pleasure, and thank you.